Hi everybody, my name is Keeley and welcome back to my reading nook. It's been a while. I have not posted a video on this channel probably since the winter, and that is because this has been my last semester of college and it's been so busy. Kind of like the kind of busy that's a little bit terrible. So I hate to say that because I really like school and I like college a lot, but I overcommitted myself a really terrifying amount, and it's made it so that it's been really hard to make time for reading, and therefore it's been really hard to make time to film a video of me talking about reading, which I'm not doing a lot of. But I do have some very exciting stuff to talk about today because I kind of wanted to recap my journey as someone who has never read Russian literature, taking a Dostoevsky class this semester. And spoiler alert, I loved it, but I wanted to kind of walk through the books that we read and kind of my thoughts on them and kind of just do a little bit of a recap because, I don't know, I just thought that maybe somebody out there also would feel the way I did, which is a little bit apprehensive about starting to read Russian literature because, I don't know, it's kind of just daunting. They're big books, very long, they're very famous, and you kind of feel like you have to be smart enough to understand them, and so you kind of feel like, maybe I'm not. But I just kind of want to share my experience so that maybe someone else out there will feel excited to read these books because I don't think that I would have read them because of the reasons I just mentioned, if not for this class. So I think I'll just get right into it, but yeah. These were the 3 Dostoevsky books that I read this semester. These were the first Russian literature books that I have ever read. And we started with Notes from Underground, which, how to describe Notes from Underground? It's really short. It's like probably, I think it's like 120 pages or something. No, it's under 100 pages. It's 91 pages. And it's essentially the musings of this character, this unnamed character that's referred to as the Underground Man. And he kind of goes through life up here. Like, he's really not living like in reality. He's very much in his head, overthinking things, very hyper aware of his thoughts, his actions, how he's coming off to other people. And I kind of felt like I said, this was the first thing I ever read from Dostoevsky. And when I read it, I was like, okay, this was super interesting as a portrayal of anxiety because it truly is someone going through their life and constantly like hiding themselves away because they're so in their head about how they're being perceived and like how they should manage these different social interactions. And so that on a small scale is really relatable to me, but on the other hand, he also has this like intrinsic like superiority complex where he's kind of like definitely wants to be a part of society, but as a coping mechanism to kind of as an excuse to not enter society, he frames it as like, I'm better than them, and they're so stupid with their like different social intricacies that he thinks he doesn't want to deal with, and so he thinks they're dumb. But as you can see, I tabbed like a lot in here because it was simply so interesting. And I want to find a specific note that I made to kind of show you what I was feeling. a lot of what I was feeling was very stream of consciousness in these notes. Like this one from page 11 says, okay, I kind of get it now. He's articulating the feeling of complaining and venting and just overall letting it out, airing out your grievances regarding the way the world and human nature works. So he's clearly kind of really angsty, I think is how I would describe him. And then I sort of started to get frustrated with the Underground Man because I have on page 12, if you don't get it, then you're not developed enough. That's on you. Then proceeds to admit his entire argument was uneven and contradictory. So, like I said, it's really a good portrayal of anxiety because he's constantly contradicting himself and then coming off as humble and then coming off as self-serving. And it's like, if you read it at face value, it's going to be really confusing. But if you read it with that understanding that it's really someone like, more of like a diary, and he kind of gives his view on the world in part 1, and then in part 2, he talks about these actual events in his life, in his past that have led him to this worldview. This really like contradictory, both nervous, insecure, but also confident worldview. And I would say that that part was my favorite, when you actually got to see the dynamics between him and some of his friends from school, the dynamics from him and a romantic relationship. You got to hear a little bit about his backstory as a child. So I would highly recommend it because honestly it was a really good introduction to like what I was in for Russian literature generally. Like these kind of contradictions that when you think about them, you realize like just how genius they were. That's kind of how I would describe it. And again, it was super short. So I would give this a try first, but then again, understand that this isn't super plot driven. This is more like diary vibes. But if you want something more plot driven, then I think start with this and then move into an actual novel. And again, this is like, I am not an expert at all. I've literally taken 1 Russian literature class. I've read 3 Russian books. So take what I say with a grain of salt, but I think it worked out really well for me as someone who was starting out. And the next thing that we moved on from after Notes from Underground was Crime and Punishment. The biggie, the famous, the one, the only, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, going into this, I was extremely intimidated. 1, because Notes from Underground was confusing, and so I was nervous that I was going to have to handle something super confusing for like almost 600 pages, which is what Crime and Punishment is. My copy is very thin, so it looks like it's not that long. It's almost 600 pages. It's very long. This translation that I have is by Richard Pevere and Larissa Volokhonsky, and that's the same translation that I have for Demons, which is the last book. I've lost my voice a little bit, so bear with me on that. And also I should note that the Notes for Undergrad copy was translated and edited by Michael R. Katz, if you want the same translation, because I know that they can really make or break your experience. So, Crime and Punishment. If you don't know what Crime and Punishment is about, and to be frank with you, I didn't really know what it was about before the semester started, which is kind of embarrassing, because it's so famous. I had obviously heard of the book, but I didn't really know what actually happened in the plot. So in Crime and Punishment, you're following this young man named Raskolnikov, and I'm not going to spoil it, but he commits a crime, and you basically watch him battle with the guilt, but in the context of an ideological battle. So it's not just about like he commits a crime and then he has to deal with the consequences. It's more so about like, why did he commit the crime and what is his justification for committing the crime? And it's basically based off of this argument about morality that Dostoevsky was critiquing, which said, well, morality is a social construct, and so nothing matters. And therefore, you can do whatever you want, even if it's against traditional morality, and it shouldn't matter to you. If you're actually like above it all and you're actually enlightened and you're actually able to see that all of this stuff is just a social contract and a social construct and it's not real, then why does it matter? And so he commits this crime sort of because of that, and also like on moral grounds, which is interesting. And the rest of the novel is him wrestling with that guilt. Other people get pulled into the mix. It's really like dramatic and funny at times, and it's kind of like this whirlwind of characters around this one character of Raskolnikov, who is the criminal, and you watch the way that people react to him, the way that he treats people, and the way that he treats people as a result of those feelings of guilt. And I mean, truly, it was so good. So this philosopher, Bakhtin, wrote about Dostoevsky and wrote about Dostoevsky as the father of multi-voicedness, which is essentially when a character is saying something and it could be meaning a lot of different things. It's basically like all the different subtext within what a character thinks and feels. And it really lends itself well to multiple interpretations. So I really enjoyed that because when we got to class discussions about Crime and Punishment, there would be different perspectives or opinions about what the characters actually meant throughout the novel. Specifically, there's a scene where Raskolnikov gets a letter from his mother, Pulcheria, and I wrote about this in one of my papers, but she is writing to him about a relationship that his sister is in, and depending on the way that you read it, she could either be trying to convince Raskolnikov that this is a good relationship or trying to convince him that it's a bad relationship, which you might be thinking, those are very different sides of the spectrum. How can both of those be going on in the same text at the same time? But they are, and you can read it and feel different things. And not just like from sentence to sentence, but in each sentence, you could almost spin it to have this feeling of like, okay, I understand what he's saying. He's trying to say that she likes this relationship. And then you're like, hold on a minute, but that could mean the complete opposite. So a lot of that is similar to what I was saying in Notes from Underground, where some of it can seem contradictory. But when you think about it, it's kind of like, that's what it is like to be a person. So he's really actually making a more realistic novel by having these multi-voiced interactions, because when you're experiencing things in your life, you know, there are moments when you're talking to someone and you kind of just don't even know how you feel about it, you know, and so it's more realistic, but it also makes it more interesting when you're reading, because you're kind of like, why did he commit this crime? What does his mother think about this relationship? You know, what is the relationship between these two other characters? Why does this character do something to another one? And it just leaves things really open. And I think with something that's as intimidating as Russian literature, that's a really freeing idea, that there are so many interpretations that you can have of the motivations. I mean, not endless, of course. Like, there are things that you could say that just would not be supported by the text, but there are so many interpretations that you can have of each moment and each motivation that no interpretation is really wrong. So for me, going into this, having no experience with Russian literature, I kind of felt like, okay, what if I don't get it? What if I don't get the interpretation? But it's like, after reading it, I'm understanding that there are so many different nuances to it that it really allows you to latch onto how you felt about it and like, what did you think about Crime and Punishment? So I hope that encourages someone to try it out. And also, like, with the length, I would say just take it one part at a time. Crime and Punishment, I think, has 6 parts and an epilogue. And so I would say just treat each part as its own little novel, and then it kind of breaks it up for you. That's kind of how I thought of it, as like checkpoints in the novel. Like, get through part 1, reassess. I really recommend getting through the whole thing, just because obviously you don't see the full picture, but I think if you're struggling to get through a really big novel, or you're struggling to start it, it can be really helpful to think of it in these chunks. Kind of the way that you think about chapters, but chapters can be like too small of an increment. Like, sometimes you need a little bit of a bigger goal. So I would say the parts of Crime and Punishment are a good way to go about that, to keep yourself motivated. And yeah, I also would recommend an audiobook of Crime and Punishment. Of this translation, they have an audiobook for it, and I really thought it was a well done one. I obviously, like I mentioned at the beginning, had a very terrifyingly busy semester, so it was really hard for me sometimes to fit in the reading, like in terms of like time that I was not spent doing other things, reading it physically. And I'm typically super anti-audiobook because I feel like it doesn't actually count as reading it, which is like super pretentious, I think, but it's kind of just how I've always felt about them. But when I was doing Crime and Punishment through the semester, I really just wanted to actually, you know, get the text into my brain. And so I was like, if that's the way that it has to be, it kind of has to be that way. So I was able to listen to it on my commute, walking to and from campus, and I would say that, like, it was great. It was still great. I still am a physical book person all the way. Excuse me. Very tired. tired. It's the last week of classes. But I would say if you're struggling to get through it, maybe try the audiobook. But yeah, that's Crime and Punishment. I really, really enjoyed it. And the only reason I'm not being as enthusiastic about it as I might have when I had just finished Crime and Punishment is because of the next book, which I simply loved. Like, I loved it so much, I can't even wait to talk about it. But that is Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this, like I said, is the same translation, so these kind of are a set, which is super satisfying to me. But yeah, this is Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this, you also might have heard it as The Devils or The Possessed, because the translation, like the word, you can translate it in different ways, but it's Demons in my copy. And Demons is quite a chunky book, is how I would describe it. It's like 714 pages, which when I first picked it up, I was like, oh my god. Because I was like, I thought Crime and Punishment was long. And that was like almost 600. This has over 100 more pages. But I would say the same way that I broke up Crime and Punishment into parts, you can do that same thing with Demons. But Demons is truly a comedy in my head. Like, I thought it was so funny. And I think that made it a lot easier to move through all the pages. Like, it was honestly just entertaining. It's about many things. There's kind of 3 novels happening at once. One is kind of a play on Fathers and Sons by Turgenev. And that book is kind of about the ideological battle between the 1840s and the 1860s in Russia. And it talks about how the older liberal generation is kind of at odds with the younger, more anarchist generation. And they don't see eye to eye because one views destruction as the way to build a new world and the other sees, you know, liberal policies, slow change, things like that. So there's that tension in the novel, which is super interesting, like family dynamics, which is something that if you've watched my channel before, you know that I literally am such a sucker for any book that talks about family dynamics. So I think I'm going to read Fathers and Sons in the future because of that. So there's that novel happening. Then, on top of that, you have a novel about the sinner. And Dostoevsky was a religious man. So you have this novel about redemption and the possibilities of redemption and whether or not redemption is possible, which is also a theme in Crime and Punishment, but there's a character in here called Nikolai Stavrogin, who is really, in class, my professor referred to it as Raskolnikov 3.0, because he's like even more Raskolnikov-y than Raskolnikov is, and if you read it, you'll understand what I mean by that. But he is really terrible, and so you're trying to see, like, can he be redeemed? So there's that novel happening, the redemption story. And then you have this novel about rebellion and about community and about the way that people are bound together in a revolution. And so there's literally 3 full novels going on, which sounds crazy, but like, I swear they all work. And it is really chunky, but you kind of need that space in order to tease out all of those separate novels that are happening at once. And for me, the thing that made it so fun was that there's a lot of scandal in it. There's a lot of like gossip in it. And again, the way that Crime and Punishment had every character kind of whirling around Raskolnikov, Demons sort of has that around Stavrogin in one of the novels, which is the novel about the sinner. It also has that happening around Pyotr. Someone's yelling outside my window. Anyways, between Pyotr and Stepan, which is more of like the Fathers and Sons novel, and then around Pyotr in the revolutionary novel. and it's a lot about ideology, so like it can be confusing because of the fact that I wasn't really educated on what the ideological battles were in the late 1800s in Russia. But when you actually like learn about them, take the time to think about it when you're reading this, it's super fascinating. And it's also super applicable. Like, you don't really need to be thinking about it as like, oh, this is just about that time in Russia, because there are a lot of parallels between any generation and the previous generation to what was happening in Russia at this time. So I almost feel like there's a huge parallel to what's happening now in our culture, which is people of the younger generation want like faster change, and people in the older generation sort of represent the 1840s liberals in Russia. So there's a lot about ideology in here, but it's all very relatable to now, so it's not like you need to understand all the intricacies of Russian history. And I would just say the drama. I kind of live for the drama in this book, and there's a lot of scandal scenes, which Dostoevsky does super well. And it literally, like the way that I was describing these like whirlwinds around each characters, it's literally like these three sort of tornadoes of novels that like are moving so fast that they're all held together at once. And it's like so good. And when you're reading it, you're just like, dang, this is simply a fantastic book. It just is. It just really is. And I liked it like a lot better than Crime and Punishment. And I think it's because it was funny. Like, Crime and Punishment was really good, but like the moments of humor are more so just like irony, things like that. This book has like moments of humor that are genuinely funny because they're actually like ridiculous things that are happening, like ridiculous conversations, ridiculous actions that are just funny. And there's this whole theme of demons, right? Of like people that go around sort of like possessing others with ideas, and then they go off and parrot those ideas, and like that obviously has a lot of parallels to right now, and people parroting what others say and not actually like thinking critically about what they're consuming. So I felt like that was a really that was a theme that resonated a lot with our society in the US today. But I would also say, if you're a fan of Jane Austen, you might like this, which kind of sounds like a bizarre parallel, but I swear, it gave me those vibes. Multiple times, I was like, am I reading the scene in Pride and Prejudice where they're at the ball and all of the gossip is happening, and like Mr. Bennet like doesn't understand that he's like being really embarrassing, or Mrs. Bennet doesn't realize that she's being really embarrassing, and Mr. Bennet is like shitting on her in front of everybody, and then the kids are kind of just like going along with the vibes. It felt like that level of scandal and drama, and like, oh my gosh, which is so fun to read. It's like, get your popcorn, watch this whole thing play out. And I would also say that it's not really a novel where you get really attached to the characters. It's more so a novel where you get really attached to the plot. Like, it is super character driven because there are so many characters that lead off these three separate novels, but you almost like don't really care about the characters. You care a lot about the plot though, and for me that like really worked. Whereas Crime and Punishment is like so about Raskolnikov, like it's so about him, and the Underground, Notes from Underground is so about the underground man. Like, Demons is about a society, and it's about the trajectory of a society and what will happen if a society moves in a particular direction. So it's very like prophetic and it's just fantastic. So I would say, like, kind of to wrap up, these three books in this order worked really well to get exposed to Russian literature and to get exposed to Dostoevsky. So I would highly recommend doing it in that order. And then there are a ton of other books by him. I recently bought The Brothers Karamazov and The Idiot. And so stay tuned. I might talk about those on the channel in the future and kind of continue my foray into Russian literature. But I would say that taking the class really made me more confident in my ability to understand not just Russian literature, but other literature that feels like it will be above my head. These big titles that are obviously super famous and have all of these crazy implications that I never really thought I would be able to comprehend. But you can, and I would just encourage you to give it a try. Start with something really short, like Notes from Underground. If it's not your jam, I would say still try Crime and Punishment, because Notes from Underground is super weird and like experimental, but cool. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of my overview of my Dostoevsky class and my thoughts on it, my feelings. I'm feeling really good coming out of it. I still have a paper to write, but I'm feeling good about that. I have sort of a trajectory that I'm gonna write it in, and it's gonna be about demons, and it's gonna be about gender dynamics in demons, which are super interesting. I didn't even mention that, but there are a lot of inverted gender dynamics in Dostoevsky, so I would just say go for it. Give it a try, and let me know what you think. So thank you so much for coming to my reading nook today, and have a great rest of your reading month, and good luck with school. If anyone else is finishing school, we can do it, I think. So thank you guys so much for coming. I will see you next time. Bye.